Oracle of the Forgotten, The Wandering Swordsman, The Great Awakening, Part 2. Odilon looked over the stranger. If anything, the skeletal themes of his armor felt weirdly familiar. He couldn't really care to try to place it right now. The sword had allowed him to wield it, so for now the human would have to let the thing make its own choice. As he observed his surroundings, he saw that Nalia had woken up again. She had somehow gotten loose from Gawain. The mark on her shoulder was glowing in a way it never had before. White flames were starting to cover up the top of her right arm. Still, she was nowhere near as strong as she should be. Forcing the man off of her had taken far more power than she imagined it would. Odilon heard the blade tell him that the fledgling Golden was still weak. It was all he needed to know for now. With such a light blade, he could meet the speed of his former brother. The two were bound up quickly in battle as the stranger began to clear the room of their enemies. A dark blue field had surrounded the stranger. It seemed to match his movements, but not perfectly. Sometimes it was behind him a little while he attacked. Other times, the form of another man marched ahead with each strike. His armor seemed to not let most of the damage through to him. Even when it did, it seemed to seal up quite quickly and close the wounds by itself. Odilon had no time to observe this. Gawain was faster and stronger than he'd been in the past. Each attack left the blade in the mortal's hand bending and nearly breaking. He needed a weapon, and soon. Nalia was not fully conscious of things, but apparently her own nakedness was something she was aware of. She'd wandered across the battlefield like a lost animal, seeming unaware of any danger as she went to the remains of one of the nearby guards. This one had been mortal. She took from them a shirt far too large for herself and threw it over her body. Slowly she picked up two blades that were on the ground. It was clear to those around her that she was unsteady. Ozan and Paziel began to make their way around and back to the half-demon. Odilon was knocked backwards. The Golden held up his hand, forcing a ball of white energy from it. The force was meant to kill the mortal. It seemed instead the attack lit the man on fire for a moment and then pushed him entirely across the room again. In the future, the Golden would refer to this ability as Heaven's Flare. This put the mortal far from the last blade he had held. He found himself in another group of demons and monsters that were still coming in from the outside. With no weapon, he grabbed onto the nearest beast, taking its horns to keep it from killing him. As the flames on his body were still dying out, the mortal held the strange bull-like creature back, a beast twice his size, but the mortal seemed to be able to handle it well enough. A few moments later he spun, taking the creature's head with him and pulling it into a roll that snapped its neck. He left it on the floor to turn to dust. A dozen more creatures ended similarly, each one with a show of impossible force from a mortal who seemed to have nothing at all to work with. Nalia felt it burning along her back again. It felt like something crawling beneath her skin. The ropes and vines still surrounded her under the loose shirt she wore. In each hand now was a simple long blade, hardly enough to matter with her situation and this crowd. Yet something stirred inside of her. When she saw the light throw Odilon back, something in her just seemed to begin to change. She closed her eyes. She could now sense the two others closing in on her location. She could feel the damage to her own body and flowed just enough energy to stop her own blood from taking her out of this fight. She realized she was already too weak to do what she wanted. Still, when she reopened her eyes, they were just as white as the fire that had begun to flow down her entire right arm. That fire wrapped around the blade in her hand, then started to ease from a white to a silvery blue. She settled her eyes first on the two gods and then on the room itself. Finally, she'd gathered enough energy. The feral scream of rage was enough to flood the room as she began to move quickly. The woman knew her time was limited now. She cut through the beasts between her and the portal. With one blade in each hand, it allowed her to move through them like a deadly trap. The spinning was enough to nearly drop her, but instead she decided to use that loss of balance to land against a nearby column. She then launched off of it to attack another row of beasts. Odilon had found another demon now. The man managed to fight it with the torn off and still fading horn of one of the recent beasts he killed. As the horn stabbed through the demon, it dropped its blade. Not nearly the quality of the one that had been taken from him, but Odilon always knew a dwarven blade when it reached his hands. The horn continued to turn the dust, and the demon along with it. This dwarven blade was strong and solid. There were no signs of magic in it other than the self-mending runes adorning all quality dwarven wares. The familiar feeling of an almost too heavy double-handed sword was a comfort. As the next angel took a strike at him, he was more than eager to show what he could do with it. The man swung the blade, blocking the attack of the angel with ease, and then spun around to cut it from behind. As he did, he let himself use the momentum of that strike to reach the next angel, this one in the air flying into battle. His blade took it down swiftly, pulling the angel from the air as he ran to his next target. The crowd seemed to disperse some now, some running back towards the outdoor portal, others gathering around the guards. Nalia had just enough time to notice that most of the cages were now nothing but shredded remains of those who had once been captive. Something in her didn't care enough to be able to mourn like she normally would have. Instead, she continued her attacks on the creatures, that is, until the man from the portal spoke out again. "Out, both of you." The stranger's voice seemed to mix with another. It was a single command, but Nalia could feel it. Her entire body flickered with the fires from her mark, as if it knew something she did not. Odilon's marking flickered and flared as well. For a brief moment he felt something tear inside his chest, pulling away as a small whisper of light left him. It was insignificant to him, a small bit of energy or blood. He'd lost so much more over the years. He was far too busy with continuing his own battle. The man could sense Nalia before she saw him. Seeing her fighting again brought out some kind of pride in him. She certainly was something, but he didn't even have time to admire that. Her energies had definitely changed, yet not in the way he had expected. Where he had expected to sense more shadow, there was only more light. It seemed as if something had mixed up in trying to turn her into a demon. He wasn't exactly wrong. The shadows were growing in her as well, but the light had been growing faster. He didn't have time to focus on any of it as another wave of attacks came in. He'd heard the order of the stranger, go through the portal. Could the man be trusted? The only clue he had was that the blade had never steered him wrong, nor had it ever let another carry it. It meant that this stranger had the same respect from it that he had. Pazio tapped Ozan on the shoulder. Once again, the man seemed to prefer not talking. Rather, he pointed at the girl than Ozan, and a moment later pointed to Odilon before pointing back to himself. The sorcerer understood. He would much rather fight the half-demon than an actual skilled swordsman. If anything, the Lord of Plagues might be the one person with the power to take the human down, at least in his opinion. Ozan started again with his illusions, wrapping the girl up in a strange world separate from their own. The illusion this time was so powerful it seemed to overlay the room. Nalia was now fighting through a small village. Anything and anyone she struck looked like a person who had once lived there. The woman stopped fighting suddenly as her gaze fell on some of the nearby people. Her memories of them seemed to have her torn. The illusions talked about her having been ill, sleeping for months before waking. The last angel she had struck looked like a villager that had once been her friend. He'd been beaten with a stick according to her vision. Even though in the real world he was slowly dying, he didn't look that badly injured. Someone escorted him away. The woman shook her head, trying to pull herself back to reality. The stranger who held the sword spent his entire time cutting down anything and everyone in his way. He had disappeared outside, closing the giant portal there, which shattered into a few smaller ones. This sealed away the ability to summon great beasts or more than 2 or 3 angels and demons at a time. It wasn't going to stop this, but he had more important matters than the human world. When his gaze settled on Odilon, he knew neither one had listened to him. The portal to his realm stayed open, unguarded, and the two still hadn't stepped through. He was angry, but his eyes moved to Nalia. He understood now. With one god distracting her, she'd already been fairly easily swept back away from fighting. Lowering her blades a moment as she tried sorting through her thoughts again. The stranger let out a low growl before speaking out again. He told Odilon once more to get her away from here. He started to walk towards the girl when he heard the voice from the sword ordering him to step back. The stranger was confused. He was convinced he'd been called because the two were outnumbered and overpowered. Still, he relented, listening to the orders of an old friend. He stepped away to fight off the hordes of angels and demons still remaining in the building. Gawain was more than happy to take the opportunity to move closer to the girl. She was meant to be his, he was certain of it, especially now that he'd awakened more to who and what was hidden inside his mortal form. His power was growing. He could sense it, feel it. The light within him was a curse to the darkness surrounding him, and she would be the perfect one to lead beside him. After all, when Odilon was away, Gawain had secured a role inside the demon realms, as well as his in this one. His wife here had secured him a throne as well, not as powerful as this kingdom, but they could take that when he wished. He could toss away his current bride or just sacrifice her later. After all, she'd failed to produce a worthy heir. When he glanced at the stranger, he merely shrugged. A part of him recognized the man, but it was a distant memory now. His mind was set on 2 things, that girl and ruining Odilon's life before killing him. They had already messed up this ceremony, his ceremony. He was already going to have a decade of work to make up for the damage unless he could kill one or both of them. Odilon caught on to the situation much faster than anticipated. Nalia was being fed illusions, this time enough of them that he could see them overlay the world around him. Paziel had moved closer and he could feel his airway cutting off again. His voice was gone. He couldn't even let out a frustrated growl or call out to Nalia or the stranger. He could feel his muscles tightening, threatening to drop him to the ground as they became more and more useless. His flesh was defiant, sores tearing open slashes across his body. For a moment, he wasn't sure what to do. An all too familiar voice whispered, "It is in your blood." Blood. The blood that had charged his blade, the blood that was still covering his dysfunctional arm, the blood that flowed in his veins. For the first time, he decided to act, fully act on what he'd been told. A loud growl of rage filled the room before a black flame covered his damaged arm. It wrapped around his nearly severed limb and reinforced it only enough that he could use it carefully. His body grew stronger, though he was unaware of it. All he knew is he had a goal, and Paziel was now face to face with him. The dwarven blade in his hand was covered with the same black flames that had formed around his body. Paziel tried once again to gain control of him with his magic. As the blade swung down towards him, the immortal shifted. It looked as though his body split in two and then formed back to whole, a short distance out of reach of the blade. This didn't even seem to slow down the human. He rushed forward, swinging the blade again. This time, he noticed the creature shifting to his left. The human followed through with his attack, swinging to where the creature had been and where he appeared. Paziel had expected this. He formed a shield of green and gray energy that suspended itself between him and that dwarven blade. He knew a little from studying previous battles. As the large blade crashed against his shield, he stepped back again, this time to the right to avoid the swing that was already coming as the mortal let the weapon rebound and spun to slash at the god's midsection. Paziel tried to paralyze him again. This time he felt a sharp pain burning through his own arm. The marking on the man's chest flared, pulsing blue energy through the shadows and forcing itself along the blade. As the plague god shielded himself, the energy shattered his shield, allowing Odilon to sever his left arm. The god tried to pull his form back together as he stepped back, but the arm was hesitant, refusing to return. Paziel growled, then pulled a hand up. The arm on the floor shattered and the pieces pulled back to bring a new arm into its place. He stared, his cold, dark gaze now locked onto the mortal. "What are you?" It was one of the very few times that Paziel had spoken. He hated to have to waste his breath on a mortal, but this one... "Your death." The human was beyond caring now. He let loose with a sudden flurry of blows. It seemed impossible, even with the lighter dwarven sword. He moved so quickly the god could barely respond. It was only moments before Paziel was cut into pieces, all limbs torn away. As he again tried to pull the magic to drag his body back together, he saw the mortal lowering the blade towards his chest. "How do we stop this?" He meant the awakening, or whatever was left of it. This had been tens of thousands of mortal deaths now. He didn't want any more. "Delay, not stop. We will come back." Paziel seemed so confident, even in this position. He began to shift himself again, drawing his pieces together in the process as his body started to split. Odilon moved. He ran to where the immortal had begun to form. His blade drove through the god, straight through the center of where he'd begun to reform. Something cracked. A loud crashing and shaking of the earth knocked loose pieces of the hull as the immortal stared at the human. This time Paziel lost his words. Every spell he had cast against the human had reversed, filling his bodies with the cuts and wounds from the plague he'd placed on him before. His breathing cut off. The immortal panicked and in a last effort took all of his energy to teleport himself away. He would have to be reborn, but he would never be the same that he once was. Ozan seemed to feel this. He turned suddenly, losing his concentration. His illusions shattered, crashing around Nalia like broken glass. The man took a step towards the mortal before the woman rushed at him. Nalia had taken the opportunity with this distraction, but her blades never struck. Instead, Gawain had caught both on his own sword and looked over her closely. "Miss me?" His words sent some kind of shiver through her. She realized that she suddenly hated him in a way she didn't know she could. She could barely even remember what happened, but staring into his eyes, she could see it all from his view. She could feel everything, as if she'd been put into her own body, but awake. The girl froze and Gawain laughed a moment before pushing back against her blades. She was off balance. It was not at all difficult to grab her. He spun her in a circle, forcing more energy into the memories and causing her to drop her blades before pulling her against him again. She found herself with her hands resting on his chest where she was trying to push him away from her. He leaned down and whispered in her ear, "I let you leave with him once. Do you think I would let him take my wife twice?" Something inside of her mind shattered again. The illusions he had cast, memories he was forcing through her. She saw herself with her blade over a different body, talking about how the humans were to be left alone, before finally following a white-haired stranger through a portal. The woman blinked, staring at the man before her a moment, then she felt something even less expected. He plunged a dagger through her ribs, driving it as deeply as he could. It's a shame, though. He wasn't ready to kill her yet. He just wanted her attention. You could still leave here with me. Nigel, why? She closed her eyes a moment, the many memories, fragments of lifetimes scattering through her mind. Odilon seemed to stir slightly at the pain in her voice. He was angry enough that his target had escaped. She seemed to be drifting again. Her body was struggling to stay upright. He could tell this situation wasn't going to get any better if he didn't rescue her. But as he looked over Gawain and then back at her, a part of him realized something else. They knew each other. A part of him felt almost betrayed at the fact that the woman hadn't told him, until the sword assured him that she didn't know until that moment. The sword, the one force in this world he could trust without any fear. It always spoke truth to him. He let out a low growl. He wanted that blade back. Still, none of that mattered at the moment. The one it had chosen told him to take her and leave. Seeing Gawain starting to open a portal only made this more urgent. He was planning to take her with him. Odilon ran forward, his blade set to strike the man he'd thought of as a brother. As soon as he was within range, Gawain turned to place the wounded girl directly between the two of them. Odilon didn't seem to hesitate, though. Death might have been better than whatever this man had planned for her next. To his own surprise, the girl was suddenly no longer between them when his blade struck the shoulder plate of the man before him. Rather, she'd been pulled out of the way by the stranger, who was pretty well pissed off with the two of them ignoring him now. The dagger still rested in her side, and the armored man removed it quickly. By all rights, she should have collapsed. The girl was feeling incredibly faint, but she was so angry now. She wasn't about to be held by anyone. Not this man, not Gawain, not any other. Greed. The voice of the stranger rang out despite the woman pushing herself away from him. He allowed her to go on her way while addressing this Golden. Gawain was holding the blade that Odilon had hit him with one hand, as if it were nothing now. His power seemed to wrap golden bands of energy around it as he started to bind up the mortal as well. Gawain did not respond. He pushed Odilon back with a little too much ease, forcing a golden barrier to rise up between them. I'll have to take what's mine, then. He began to walk towards Nalia again, if anything all too casually, as if he thought the bindings and the barrier would be enough to stop the human. For a short time the barriers and bonds did hold, but the stranger suddenly attacked. His strike took the Golden through the portal behind him, where he quickly followed. Ozan was left to his own devices now. He'd recovered some from the loss of his friend, and he started to cast another set of illusions, only to find a very large dwarven blade flying through the air. The blade split this god in half, where he collapsed to the ground. Nalia was able to stay on her feet, but barely. The second Odilon came close, she collapsed against him. "Stop saving me." She didn't fully mean it. She was embarrassed at the state of things. She'd actually meant to stay conscious. Feeling his arms around her brought her just enough peace she couldn't keep from falling into the flickering darkness of her own mind. Odilon saw Ozen starting to pull his form back together. More creatures were entering from the outside, and he finally decided they needed to retreat. For the first time he could recall in ages, this just wasn't worth the fight. He lifted Nalia up and carried her through the portal. Darkness, cold, bitter, beautiful darkness surrounded the both of them. As he kept running, he could feel the light behind him closing. The tunnel they were in was all too quickly collapsing in on itself, nearly as fast as he could run. He carried her through, finding himself in what seemed like a quiet cottage living room. He stood, glancing around, still on guard as ever, as the portal closed quickly behind him. It wasn't long before a woman approached them both, black hair and pure green eyes. Scales ran up her neck and shoulders. The woman cursed quietly beneath her breath, lowering her sword as she saw them both. That room, carry her in there. She wasn't about to give him time to argue. She knew instantly who they were. She was going to do whatever she could to patch them up on behalf of her master. Odilon stared a moment, confused by the familiarity of everything. He couldn't place it, but he did feel that she could be trusted. He carried Nalia into the room, where both would have their wounds treated. The serpent woman knew exactly why they were sent here, but she hadn't been told they would be in this condition. She didn't have many supplies, but for a human, had it been any other, she wouldn't have bothered, as she knew exactly who he was. Her own memories of another of his lifetimes left her feeling almost protective of the boy. If anything, it reminded her of what kind of man he'd become before. She sighed, focusing on the girl's injuries first. As their respective fires faded from their body, the two began to have even more injuries appear upon them. Odilon's arm went limp again. He felt more tired than he could ever remember. All he wanted was to rest, but he wasn't going to allow it. He wasn't letting his guard down again. He was beginning to lose consciousness himself when he heard the woman speaking. Maybe it's good he's an idiot. She was still focused on cleaning up and bandaging Nalia. Odilon assumed that she'd been speaking about him, but he was frankly too exhausted now to move. It felt like a million weights were on his body. While the half-demon was rested in the bed, he fell asleep on the chair. When he woke, he realized that he was still incredibly naked, but had been bandaged. A blanket had been rested over his lap, offering privacy that he didn't expect the stranger to bother with. A change of clothes had been left for the both of them, rested on a dresser nearby, with a note saying that they needed to get dressed and come speak with the lord of the cottage. While getting dressed, Odilon saw a brief flash of somewhere else. He wasn't sure what it was, but he didn't really have time to worry about it. Nalia had dressed herself relatively quickly. While his clothing were simple as they often were, hers were somehow almost shimmering. A part of him wondered if it was something that had changed with her. Still, she hadn't spoken and barely made eye contact at the moment. He wasn't sure what all was going through her mind, but he could imagine. If anything, his imagination was probably worse than anything her own mind was producing. Nalia's clothing weren't all that different than what she would normally wear, except maybe the skirt. The blouse was soft, almost white blue. The corset was black with blue inlays, and a skirt deep black, almost unnaturally so. It still seemed to have light or sparks within it. Odilon figured it was an elvish fabric. Not something they see often, but it seemed whoever owned this house was wealthy enough to have whatever he wanted. When the two did emerge, she was fairly unsteady. Odilon sighed, then placed an arm lightly around her waist. When she smiled up at him, it was weak, but a genuine expression of thanks that he had to appreciate. He wasn't sure how long it would take, or even if she could recover. In the living room was a bookshelf, a fireplace, an armor stand, a chair, and a sofa. I actually think that's way too descriptive. The living room was fairly simple. It seemed like many cottages that would be found in human villages. A hooded figure rested in a chair near the fireplace. Not far from it was an armor stand. His hands were near skeletal, as if his flesh and muscle had molded together and he was almost half dead himself. Across his lap laid a very familiar blade, one that he was busy cleaning blood from as he let himself rest by the fire. Even looking at them, there was no light beneath his hood. His face seemed shaded by an eternal field of darkness. Only two glowing blue eyes seemed to exist now, settling on the pair of them one before the other. He glanced down at the blade and then nodded before telling them to have a seat. He had a lot to explain and so little time. Nalia had addressed the stranger as Void and then followed by clarifying that this was the real one. A set of questions and answers would soon follow. The sword had responded to Nalia speaking its native language, and it decided to summon the only person it knew could wield it in the past. The man had raised his hand, moving the blade to lean against the armor stand. He explained that he would depart, perhaps forever, from the realms soon. He was dying. He told the two that they were not ready to fight the gods alone, not yet, not when neither one was whole. You are already being reborn, but her, she was some time ago. He settled his eyes on Odilon. This led to questions, a lot of them. Odilon had felt no different, but he was taken a moment through a vision of the place he'd seen before. The elder god explained to them that they could conquer their new selves to regain their souls, or they could end this here and return completely to the new bodies. Odilon asked where to find this golden one. He wanted to know where Gawain had gone. He was told the name of the realms that Greed owned, and that he was very rarely in his own lands. He often dealt with the gods who had given him fairly free rein since the death of the previous sin. Nalia hadn't spoken at all since introducing Void. She seemed to be lost in thought. As they spoke more, she reached a moment for Odilon's arm. She drew back almost instantly when he flinched in pain as her fingers landed on his bandages. The woman stayed truly quiet as he placed an arm around her. She wasn't interested in talking, it seemed. Void sighed and then spoke. It's not lost forever. It was taken from his grasp. He didn't clarify that statement, but Nalia glanced at him before she just bit down on her lip and closed her eyes again. She understood, and perhaps Odilon did as well from watching her reaction. The mortal finally spoke his mind, though. The blade, when can I have it back? His words were filled with some kind of determination. He refused to believe that it had turned on him. It had still helped him through the last battle, even if it wasn't in his hand. Void glanced at the blade, then the armor before he shook his head. I thought he'd return to me. He made it quite clear his intentions. He motioned to the armor. You will have another part of him when you leave. Beware, though, the armor does not hold the same kindness as the sword. The elder explained further that the armor would prevent his death, but it would never be pleasant. That it would heal him with parts of itself, shards of metal inside the body, until it healed around it. It would not let the one who wears it die, not while it was on them. Odilon understood now. This would give him the power to finally kill the ones who had harmed her and his people, and to find his revenge against Gawain for betraying them all. I wondered why he chose you. Void spoke softer now. Even though I chose you last time you were here. That phrase seemed to confuse the mortal, and yet he knew every bit of it was true.
He could sense the familiarity. When I saw you fight without it, when he saw you fight, the old king made himself clear. You were chosen, and no other would hold him longer than it took to return to you. The words felt a little heavier this time. Void didn't wish to lose his old friend, but it seemed that this was how it was meant to be. Your mark will lead them to you, and you to them. You can choose to have it removed now, or keep it. You will have this choice every time you are reborn, and as he declared, you forge your own destiny. Void's eyes turned then from Odilon towards Nalia. As for you, you have so far to grow and no one to guide you. I apologize. You will always have access to what is mine. He fell silent again. He couldn't tell if his coming death was permanent or not. He'd expected it to be so much more detailed. He spoke in his own language to the serpent woman in the room. She was strong, clearly, but it seemed she was holding back her own emotions now. She had known this was coming. No amount of effort to sustain that body would last forever. It was exhausting to both of them for as long as this had gone on. Let me fight them. Nalia spoke up this time finally. She didn't want this to continue. She was still angry, hurt, and confused by everything. Earn your way. The words of Void were colder than he meant them to be. She wasn't yet ready yet, and he knew it. He turned back to Odilon again. You both write your own destiny. My mark only helps you with doing that. You have to make your choices yourselves. He knew that the two would have a long way to go, even if they chose to stay and fight. They were both going to die. He could see it, and all he could do was make sure that it wasn't permanent, if the sword hadn't already made that certain for them both. Nalia insisted she would fight her way through all the 9 realms of shadows for vengeance, but it was her grief talking at that moment. She was told that quickly by the man across from her before he turned his attention back to Odilon. When you leave my door, you will be on a path in the shadows. Straight will take you to the dark realms of the demons, left to the mortal realms. If anyone thought Nalia was the root of anger right now, they hadn't looked into the soul of the man beside her. He felt that they had been used as toys in some game by the gods, and he assured Void and the woman if they continued to meddle, he would remove the gods, then return back here to kill them both as well. Finally, Void smiled beneath his mask. The boy certainly sounded like his mother and father had when they came here the first time. This soul was still filled with fire. He wondered what the books would reveal about him in the future. It wasn't long before Void was set to answer their questions as well, including the one about Nalia being incomplete. Void became evasive for the first time since they began talking. He eventually revealed that her other part was there in the Dark Realms. If that was their choice, they would still have to travel before she left again for the human world. Nalia was back to silence again. It seemed she was now fully lost in her thoughts. Void sighed and finally spoke up again. When you know who you both are, truly are, I wonder if anyone can ever stop you. This was mostly musing on his part. He realized now why they'd been chosen. For her, it would never fully be a choice. The gods would never leave her alone. For the mortal, aside from the old pacts between them, he was really free to do as he pleased. Void knew the girl better than anyone. She would fight for her freedom forever. She would only know freedom when she finally accepted herself fully. The man, the mortal was much more of a mystery to him, as he had been to the girl. He was unbound from fate, but tied to their realms. Only they could decide their own future, and even the gods could not stop them forever. Void had excused himself, but before he motioned towards the sword and armor. The armor will always return here. The sword, well, he'll find his way where he needs to be at the right moment. He never explained. He only turned and walked down the hallway, where he disappeared through a door at the end. The second he did, the energy of the marks burned again, shifting, then changing before finding a place to settle upon the both of them. The two took an unknown amount of time to heal. Within the void, time wasn't the same as the outer world. It could have been ages, it could have been days. To them, it felt like about a week or so at most. They discussed all that had happened, and Nalia seemed to be recovering well now from her experience. She checked on her mortal partner to see how his recovery was, despite his insistence that he was fine. After they were ready, they prepared to leave. The Serpent Woman gave Nalia new armor and a bodysuit that would give her better movement to the skirt. To everyone's surprise, the half-demon actually chose to add the skirt back to her outfit, splitting it to work well with the clothing below. The demon woman supplied them both with anything they needed. She seemed to have a sort of fondness for the human, but more maternal than anything else. If anything, she acted like they were both her children, but perhaps the mortal most of all. Odilon began to place the armor on his body. There was a brief moment, a sensation of absolute, bone-freezing cold, but it passed quickly. The armor began to change. The features were shifting from skeletal to nearly looking like some wild beast. The armor adjusted itself to his body, each piece pulling around him and closing up the wounds as it passed. As he placed the bracer over his right arm, he felt something stab through him. Ice filled his bones, bound to his arm, and tied itself within his flesh. Before long, his fingers began to ball into a pained fist. The pain gradually lessened, or perhaps he became used to it. It didn't matter. His hand was working again. He reached out to grab the blade and felt a familiar voice begin to fill his mind. "Do you understand yet?" It knew it had far more work to do with the mortal, yet it was this mortal that had made him feel a faint glimmer of hope within the soul that had long left behind. It wasn't long before the two were on the path, standing at the crossroad. There was nothing around them, only the glow of the cobblestone path beneath their feet, and just a small distance ahead. The door they had come from was now gone. When their eyes met, the choice was made clear to both of them. They began to march straight, prepared to embrace whatever future was beyond the portal in the demon realms.